everyone, it's Lauren Gow, the editor of Strategic Risk in Asia. I know that it says Kinley, who is our European editor. We're not quite sure why that is, so I'm just going to be Kinley for the day, which is fine by me. We will shortly get started on this, but I just wanted to explain sort of the reason why we're doing this Changing Risk Day. It's the end of the campaign that we've been running all year. We came up with this idea early last year that we wanted to be able, early this year, that we wanted to be able to change risk in a meaningful way. We get told a lot by risk managers that, there's lots of parts that are sort of traditional risk management, and that certainly boards and C-suites appreciate that. But there's also lots of you out there that wanted to effect new change, to do things in new ways. So we were essentially joining people together to let you know that you're not the only one, because you're often isolated in the business, but you're not the only one who thinks this way, that many of your peers also think the same way. And this was sort of our way of letting you share your ideas with each other. And we hope that it's been a really useful tool this year. So this is the combination of all of this. So we're coming together to hear from all sorts of people all over the globe over the next 24 hours on what they think needs to change about risk management. So first up, we have Karla, who is currently working at the Newcastle University, and she is going to run through her ideas on what she wants to change for changing risk. And I will start with her very shortly. Karla, it's over to you whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Lauren. As Lauren has said, I'm Karla Gahan. I'm delighted to be part of Changing Risk Day today and to kick things off. I've been a risk and business continuity manager for many years now, and I've worked globally, based out of London. And as Lauren has said, I'm now based at the University of Newcastle here in Australia, so it's good to be home. One of the favourite aspects of my role is dealing with people and watching how what we do as risk managers can make a real difference to them. It's incredibly satisfying for me to engage in a piece of work where at the start there might be resistance or a lack of interest, but by the time we finish a phase or we embed a new practice, there's a real sense of ownership and collaboration at play. So I am a big fan of art. So that's a picture of me, and this is a picture of one of my photos. I like to dabble with photography, and I like to take pictures of ordinary things and try and look at them differently and change perceptions and perspectives by adding colour or filter or light. The author, Anais Nin, said that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So each time I take a photo, I'm reminded that we need to look at things not only from our own perspective, but we can share our views with other people. Why am I talking about photography and art and perception on a webinar on unconscious bias or bias in risk management? Well, as part of countering bias, both as a risk manager and in our own lives, it's down to our ability to see things differently from different perspectives. So a few years ago, as part of the AMBCI and CAS Business School Leadership Program, I had the opportunity to do a piece of research, and I chose to look at bias and unconscious bias as a risk management issue. So, for example, how does bias influence the risk management process? As risk managers, are we guilty of biasing the processes we use to identify and assess risks? Is bias always bad? Now, these are really big questions, and I don't propose that we will answer all of them, or indeed any of them particularly in today's session. But what I wanted to do is share with you some of the findings from the high-level investigation I did as part of that paper. Share some of those observations and perhaps shift some of your perceptions as well, because some of mine were definitely changed as part of this process. It's estimated that up to 90% of our thought processes happen automatically as subconscious reactions. So many of you will have read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and he refers to this as System 1 thinking. That is, it's automatic, it's fast, it's reflexive, it's irrational, it's emotive, and it's associative. we tap into these subconscious reactions or shortcuts to make quick judgments. This is part of our evolutionary development, and it's helped us as a species to survive. It taught us that by sticking with our tribe, we're safer than trying to survive alone in the wilderness, and by being with people who look just like us and doing as they did, we were safe. So just like these elephants, we're social beings at heart, and we want to feel a sense of belonging. However, in very, very simple terms, this kind of thinking is at the very root of bias. So before I talk about what this means in practice for us as risk practitioners, I'd like to offer you some common language we can use when we start to think about bias. You'll have heard of many of these before. However, I found as part of my research that by naming things and by giving bias a language, it means it can be easier to call out if we need to counter it. So confirmation bias, as we mentioned before, we've evolved as a species to care about what others think about us. We tend to want other people to approve of our views and opinions, so we tend to seek out others who are similar to us in order to confirm our position. So as a brief exercise, I'd like you all to think about 5 people from your network who you would go to for professional advice. Now, I want you to discount people from that list who are the same age as you, the same race, have the same educational background, are the same gender, and I think you start to get the idea. To counter this bias, we need to consider expanding our networks so that we can build a true sense of cognitive diversity. We need to build a culture of curiosity and challenge so that we can ensure that we're seeking views from as many people as possible to highlight all relevant risks and opportunities. Groupthink. We've all been in a meeting where people agree with one another because we don't want to be seen as the odd one out. Many biases are rooted in fear of being excluded or being perceived as being different. This also ties into the confirmation bias in terms of seeking validation for our views. And you'll notice that many of these biases we're discussing are interconnected. The sunflower bias, which is my favourite because I love the name, it's named after the fact that all of the faces of the flowers turn towards the sun or leader. Again, this is a bias rooted in fear. We don't want to look foolish in front of our boss or those in senior positions, and we may believe because of their role they must know best. So we agree with them on that basis, and what they say goes. This isn't helpful in terms of creating a healthy culture so people feel valued and able to contribute no matter what their position in the organisation, and not just from the leadership down. This can be lethal for risk managers who don't feel able to challenge the risks being discussed, as you might not be capturing the real threats or opportunities to an organisation. And then there's overconfidence, which tends to be demonstrated by leadership, although not always. When we've done something successfully once, or perhaps if something's never gone wrong, there's a tendency to overestimate the possibility of a successful outcome in the future. We tend not to seek out examples of where things have gone wrong and where we can learn lessons from these so-called failures. Instead, we believe that success is the only way forward. From a risk management perspective, this can be an issue when considering the probability of risks occurring, as we might over or underestimate the likelihood or impact of risks based on our own views. So some more common biases: availability bias. Have you ever had a meeting sidetracked by somebody talking about what they've seen on the news this morning or by what somebody's told them in the previous meeting? This is a classic example of availability bias. We tend to remember and talk about things we've seen or heard recently. This can bias the risk management process, as people will tend to recall big events or something that's happened recently. Anchoring is fascinating. Have you ever bought something that you thought was a bargain and then found out later that you had been overcharged or it wasn't really a bargain after all? We tend not to question the original price or anchoring point. We believe it to be correct from the outset. In the context of risk management, just because something's always been on a risk register, we may assume it's there for a reason and we don't think to question its validity. Likewise, there's a status quo bias. So from a behavioural standpoint, we tend not to embrace change easily. As we mentioned earlier, our brains prefer to make quick and easy decisions. We like things to stay the same. And from a risk management perspective, this means that we tend not to question what's already in existence on our registers. Just like anchoring, we assume because it's already there, it must be there for a good reason. And of course, I will always say that we need to be curious and challenge these risks and perceptions. I'd now like to introduce another concept I came across as part of my research, which might help you to start thinking about how to manage bias in your organisation. So looking at this slide, you know that the black circles are exactly the same size. However, our brains are perceiving them as being different sizes. You may have heard of the example of health practitioners suggesting to people wanting to lose weight that they should use smaller plates, thereby anchoring the perception of the portion size and nudging the mind to believe that they're eating more and feeling fuller, even though the amount of food on the plate has been reduced. The key word here is nudging. In practical terms, it means that the brain can be nudged or guided into making better decisions in line with its own interests or good behaviours. A nudge influences behaviour without inducement, threat, or argument, and still allows for freedom of choice. It's designed to help anchor the unconscious mind on the desired outcome without needing to engage the rational part of the brain that might sabotage that behaviour. It's about framing options to influence choices. So this technique is widely recognised and it's used in many different areas of influence, including policy making and, unsurprisingly, marketing. The UK government actually created a nudge unit which helped to create changes and improve processes for several government departments, which ultimately led to increased tax revenues by millions of pounds just by using subtle changes in language of tax letters to induce people to pay their tax on time. So as risk managers, we have a unique and privileged position in terms of being able to recognise and assist in countering bias or in nudging people into making better decisions. When assessing and discussing risks, we're given direct access to what happens in all areas of an organisation, and we've got the opportunity to observe those behaviours firsthand. When we notice biases as part of our role, we can help implement measures or nudges that help change behaviours and improve culture. We need to be alert to different types of bias and learn how to challenge them in constructive ways, both when we recognise them in others, whilst being mindful of our own behaviour. So, for example, in terms of risk assessments or attending risk committee meetings, there's the potential that the biases influencing the outcome of those meetings mean that you're liable to arrive at conclusions without considering alternatives. For example, there's a risk that what you're capturing is what people want you to hear, rather than an accurate picture of what is or could be impacting your organisation. So that's confirmation bias. There's the likelihood that people don't want to make any changes to the risks or controls because it will take cognitive effort to consider alternatives. So that's the status quo bias. And then there's the possibility that people will talk about risks that relate to what's at the forefront of their mind, either in terms of what you're working on or what's in the press at the time of your discussion. So that's availability bias. So how do we counter some of those biases? So the first idea is a pre-meeting or workshop survey. So whilst conducting surveys is a standard technique for risk identification, I was never a fan. However, I have been converted. It's helpful in reducing bias from several perspectives. It helps to focus the conversation in subsequent meetings, and it elicits a personal view of the subject at hand, thereby avoiding groupthink. For example, when running an assessment session with the board or the C-suite, each person will have their own agenda when it comes to risk ownership and appetite, and by asking the group to provide separate responses, there's less chance of group influence, especially if a meeting's running short on time and people are rushing their decisions. It might also mean that trends are identified in the responses, and you can then focus your attention on the outlying risks, which might warrant further discussion. The second idea is scenario planning, or the pre-mortem technique. They're two different things. So scenario planning, as you will all know, brings risks to life so that participants can feel the need to make changes in relation to a particular risk and the possible outcomes. People become more emotionally invested in finding the best solutions. Likewise, desktop exercises and simulations can help identify gaps in business continuity and crisis management plans should an incident occur. It also offers the opportunity to identify any biases in the behaviour of those involved in managing a crisis so that these can be reviewed appropriately. The more emotionally charged a learning experience is in relation to countering bias, the better it's remembered. For example, if a crisis manager will only delegate tasks to a single member of the team, This can objectively be identified as part of the exercise and mitigation strategies put into place. The crisis manager might do this because they know and trust an individual or they're alike in some way. However, this can cause bottlenecks in a crisis, and this behaviour absolutely needs to be avoided, and I have seen this happen. The pre-mortem technique tips scenario planning on its head. It originates from the premise that a business decision has gone wrong, and it requires the decision makers to work backwards from that point to determine how things ended up at this outcome. In behavioural terms, failures are felt more keenly than successes. So this technique incentivises participants to determine mitigation strategies as they experience so-called failure in a safe environment. It also challenges hindsight biases. That is, I knew what was going to happen all along, hence the name hindsight bias. It helps to mitigate those risks. From a risk assessment perspective, this technique enables people to engage in more creative ways of thinking to determine how best to manage specific risks. It invites diverse opinions to come together to find the best solutions for an organisation. So an inclusive culture, we've already talked about confirmation bias and the fact that we tend to gravitate to people who are similar to us. In a work environment, that might be unavoidable. However, as we've already said, it can bring us a very narrow view of the world. In the context of risk identification and assessments, we should seek views from across the organisation before discussing with a senior or exec level, so that we can challenge and stimulate an informed conversation, helping to counter that sunflower bias. And that's strongly linked to a curiosity and challenge culture. It might be helpful to bring in a trusted independent party to play the role of devil's advocate in meetings when you're trying to make a significant decision. Recognising that challenging the decision-making process is about making better business choices, and it's not personal, means that creating this role can help take the heat out of considering alternative options. The independence of this individual means that they can ask questions about why a specific decision is favoured and what alternatives might want to be considered. Creative or alternative channels of thinking can then be pursued, and the risk of bias is then reduced. So 2 stories. This is my favourite. We're going back to where we started on perception. One way to break the habit of judging people or making biased decisions is to consider 2 alternative stories for people you come across rather than rely on your own internal narrative. And it doesn't have to be 2, it can be more than 2. Back in April last year, a woman was forcibly removed from the British Film Institute for laughing too much at her favourite film, which is The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. As she was removed, the audience applauded. Tamsin Parker, 25, was celebrating her birthday. Tamsin also has Asperger's. If the people in the audience and the people in that cinema had taken the 2-story approach and considered alternative stories, then this could have been avoided altogether. The story wouldn't have hit the press, causing Tamsin even more trauma than was necessary. So when we as risk managers are confronted by situations that we're judging to be obstructive to our processes or counter to good risk management practices, we need to take a step back and question what else might be at play. Is there a reason for the behaviour or breach of process? Is there an element of fear involved or reluctance to change? If we can step back and challenge ourselves to consider a different perspective, then we can open the channels of communication to discover the root cause, and we can help influence the change that might be required. So that takes us right back to where we started. The 2 stories approach gives us an opportunity to consider things from another perspective and to help counter bias. And although our instincts might be to maintain the status quo and to keep focused on that sense of belonging in our organisations, our role as risk managers is to find ways to constructively challenge our colleagues so that the right risks and opportunities can be identified and managed. So that was the whistle-stop tour, I'm afraid. That was a very quick run through canter. Lauren, back to you.
Thank you so much, Karla. That was absolutely fascinating. I do have one question to start with, and then I have one from our audience already, but I've got one as well. But I'll start with the audience question. Someone's asked, are there any books that you would suggest risk managers read to learn more about and how to apply these ideas?
There are lots and lots of books, and there's also lots of good articles in Harvard Business Review. So if you look for things in terms of behavioural economics, you will find books on nudging. I can't remember the titles off the top of my head. If you send me your details, I can send you lists of books. There is an entire book dedicated to the nudge unit being created for UK government. There are books on nudging for diversity and inclusion practitioners. One of the authors is Tina Nielsen. There's a lot of good work around that. Obviously, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman. There are books I think there's one just called Nudge. There are lots of books on nudging. And as I said, if you Google the Harvard Business Review, you'll come up with lots of books, lots of articles that talk about things like the counter techniques, the pre-mortem technique, playing devil's advocate, really interesting materials.
I just want to remind everyone that if you want to ask a question, it's just down the bottom of the Q&A section. You can type it in and I'll read it out. A question from me, Karla, it's something that comes up frequently in all aspects of changing risk this year is it how to actually broach this with management, but where to actually begin to identify it. It's, that what's the initial seed? Can you give people an example of what they're actually looking for? You've given it in an overall sense, but is there something that they can look for, say, in the next meeting in 2 hours from now?
So in my previous role, my colleague and I, as I was doing this research, we sat down and we worked with our colleagues, and we actually shared some of this research with them, which might sound like a strange thing to do, but we had a very open culture. So we sat down and we called out this language, and we taught people some of the names of these different biases so that we could call them out to one another, and we would pull each other up if we saw those things happening. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, and I appreciate that's not something that everybody can do in every organisation. But we found it really helpful, and I'm still in touch with this colleague, and we still call it out in one another, because what I discovered as part of this research was it's very difficult to identify bias, and in particular unconscious bias in yourself. So building a culture around giving things names, calling them out, and trying to de-bias situations. It's not that bias is always a bad thing, as we talked about in the nudging concept. Sometimes you want to harness those biases in order to push people forward. So, for example, I'll go off on a tangent here if that's okay. In compliance, you might want to use that nudging technique. You want to harness some of that herd mentality, if you like, thinking back to the elephants. The concept of nudging means that you want to, one of the ways you can use it is to make people feel like they are part of the herd. People want to be accepted. People want to be part of a crowd. So by saying things like 95% of your colleagues have completed the compliance training, as long as that is accurate information, that can and has been demonstrated to increase compliance with that kind of training. Did that answer your question, Lauren?
Actually, thank you. We've had another question from the audience. There's a huge focus on culture and cultural risk now. Do you see this as an important element of this, and should firms be prioritising their thinking around this?
Culture or cultural risks? Yes, I think that's a very big question. I think this definitely feeds into culture, because, as I said, if we can start educating people as to creating a more inclusive culture, trying to seek more diverse views and opinions across an organisation, of course that's going to talk to just organisational culture, not just risk culture. So I think the two are interconnected, and I think it's really important.
We've had a question from Priscilla Taylor, who's on the line. If you have a sunflower bias, she loves the name like you do.
Yes.
What's the best way to approach this, given it is top down, as in part of the culture?
I think it's, as risk practitioners, we need to be confident in what we do, and we need to recognise and believe in what we do. And it's feeling comfortable in your own skin, I guess, and having the confidence to make those challenges. Remember, going back to that point on devil's advocate, and remembering that all of this is business related and it's not personal. If you're challenging the risks that somebody's raising, back it up with facts. It's about improving your organisation. I know that is an incredibly hard thing to do, depending on the personalities and the egos involved. But I think it's a really important one, because we risk missing out on risks. We risk not identifying the things that could bring us down. So part of this, and I suppose this whole talk on bias talks to communication, and what we keep talking about is the softer skills of risk management. I don't think they're soft at all. I think they're incredibly hard. But as risk managers, I think the more we can improve our communication skills and our knowledge and understanding of these type of skills, the more we can bring benefit to our businesses and organisations.
There's another question here. Can you give an example of how you've applied these ideas in practice at some of your businesses?
Sure. So as I mentioned in my previous organisation, we took this to heart, and we really called this out. So we practiced 2 stories a lot. It's really easy to go into a meeting, and I think, interviews as well, you might prejudge people. You look at somebody and within 30 seconds you will have made a judgment about that person. My direct colleague and I use this all the time, and we still use it. When I contact him, we still use it, we still talk about it, and we call out the 2 stories thing. We found it really helpful, particularly when people were behaving in ways that we would normally judge or we would find challenging. So it's very easy to moan and gripe about somebody. But if you stop and try and think, okay, what is causing this behaviour? Is this behaviour driven by fear? Is it driven because they've got something else going on in their life? It makes you, without sounding too wafty, it makes you a little bit more compassionate. So when you go into meetings, you might be frazzled, but if you take a step back and try and see things from another person's perspective, you're not coming in defensive, and it opens the channels of communication. And this is not just a risk management process. This is something that I try and apply in my day-to-day life. It's not easy, but I find it really beneficial. So I hope that helps the person who asked that question.
It does. I have another question from me. I think you touched on this briefly, but I've got a 6-year-old, and they always talk about, at school, listening ears, the importance of listening.
Oh, okay.
Listening ears rather than just hearing ears. Is this something that risk managers should use to help identify bias?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think having a language around it and recognising it is step 1. And step 2 is understanding some of the motivations behind why people might be biased. That can help. Then you will be able to have a better, start employing other techniques to manage around those biases. If you go to a meeting and all somebody talks about is the same risk over and over and over again, why are they talking about that? What might be at the root cause of that? How can we open up that dialogue a little bit better? And so even though they're saying the same thing, maybe you're not hearing what they're saying. They're saying that for a reason. I like the listening ears thing a lot. I might do that language.
I use it quite a lot at home as well. Just another question here, which is an interesting one. Have you done wider company training on the issue to get teams to understand this?
No, I haven't. I've given this talk variously to diversity and inclusion practitioners and to risk managers, but I've not gone in and done specific training on this, not in any formal sense. So as I said, in my previous employment, we did sit around and have an informal conversation around this and did informal training on it. I don't think there's no reason why you couldn't do this. I think the more you open up these conversations, the better communication is, and that's critical to everything we do.
So where to next with this concept? It's one of my favourite questions.
Where to next? So this is one of my pet subjects. I love this subject. I continue to research this and I continue to apply it in my day-to-day life, not just in risk management. I would love everyone to think about it. I think if we can start thinking about the way we identify and assess risks and how we might open up dialogues and get people thinking a bit more broadly about risks. We know, any one of us can sit down and say what the top 10 risks for most industries are at the moment. Are there any others? How do we start challenging people's perceptions? We all go to conferences and we all hear the same kind of dialogue, and that's why I'm particularly keen on this, challenging risk concept. If we can start thinking a bit broader and thinking about how we might challenge some of those biases, then that's really important. For other people, I would love them to come on this journey with me. For me, I will continue to take it.
One final question from me before we wrap up, Karla, is should people practice this outside of work as well? Should you practice this personally?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it will also stick. If we practice these things in our personal lives, this isn't just something for work. This is, you heard the story about the British Film Institute. When I heard that story, I was really personally affected by that. I thought that was really hard story. It hit the press and caused quite a shockwave. If we start applying this in our personal lives, and it flows through into our work lives as well, and vice versa. So absolutely.
Fantastic. Karla, thank you so much for giving this presentation and being open to all the questions. It was really amazing. And if anyone wants to reach out to Karla, I'm sure you can find her on LinkedIn and ask any more questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lauren. And wishing you well for the rest of the 24 hours.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. So we're going to take a break now. We'll come back at 1 p.m. Sydney time. Which is about 10 a.m. in Singapore. We'll have Farshad Shah on the phone, who is going to be talking about using data and technology to make better risk decisions. So please come back and join us then.